3 months after Lydia died, I bought a cabin in Ash Hollow, Oregon. It wasn't on any tourist maps or highway billboards, just a tiny dot in the forest that promised exactly what I needed: anonymity. No neighbors bringing casseroles with pitying smiles. No colleagues walking on eggshells around the widower. Just trees, silence, and enough physical labor to exhaust me into dreamless sleep. The real estate agent practically pushed the pen into my hand at closing. "It's perfect for someone who wants to be left alone," she said, her eyes darting toward the tree line. I'd taken it as understanding my situation. Now I wasn't so sure. My first week passed in a blur of unpacking and minor repairs. The cabin sat on the town's edge, backing up to dense woods that stretched toward mountains I couldn't name. I ventured into the single main street for supplies, where people nodded politely but fell quiet whenever I approached. I initially dismissed this as small-town suspicion of outsiders. Then I started noticing the patterns. Everyone in Ash Hollow moved with identical, measured steps. Their expressions remained blank until they spoke directly to you, then animated with such sudden enthusiasm it felt rehearsed. And they all, every single resident, wore the same empty look in their eyes, like dolls with the batteries running low. I first noticed it at the general store while reaching for coffee on the top shelf. The shopkeeper appeared at my side without a sound. "You must be Mr. Carter," he said, his face snapping from vacant to pleasant so quickly I almost stepped back. "The cabin on Pine Ridge Road." "That's right," I said, extending my hand. "Daniel." He ignored my hand, placing the coffee in my basket instead. "We don't get many newcomers in Ash Hollow, especially ones who live alone." "Well, I'm not much for company these days." "You won't need to worry about that here," he replied, his smile fixed while his eyes remained dull. "We respect privacy in Ash Hollow." I turned toward the register, pretending not to notice two women by the produce suddenly stopping their conversation. They stared at me without blinking, heads tilted at identical angles. "When's the next church service?" one whispered to the other loud enough for me to hear. "Wednesday evening," came the reply. "And Sunday, of course, the usual times. Pastor says it's important everyone attends, no exceptions. For the renewal, we all need it after so long." They stopped talking when they realized I was listening, their faces going blank like I'd seen all over town. I paid fast and got out, feeling them watch me all the way to my truck. On the way home, I drove the long way around town, slowing down when I passed the church. It stood by itself with an old iron fence almost covered in ivy. The building looked really old, dark stone, tall skinny windows with colored glass, and a steeple that tilted a bit. Unlike the nice stores on Main Street, the church looked kind of run down, like they wanted to keep it looking old on purpose. I got too curious. Wednesday night I parked on the hill above town, watching people come out of their houses at exactly 7 o'clock. No bells rang, no signals I could see. But every door in Ash Hollow opened at the same time, and people stepped out together. They walked without talking or looking at each other, moving in straight lines toward the old church. Men, women, kids, all walking the same way with the same blank faces. From where I sat, they looked like game pieces moving by rules I didn't get. The church doors opened as they got close, though I couldn't see who opened them. Everyone went inside, the doors closed, and nothing happened for 3 hours. I waited, eating my sandwich and checking the time. At exactly 10 o'clock, the doors opened again. The change in the crowd wasn't obvious, but it was there. They moved smoother now, almost gliding. Their faces had expression. They smiled, waved their hands, and seemed to chat casually as they headed back home. But something about how they looked was still off, like they were acting happy instead of really feeling it. Their smiles never reached their eyes, and their laughing sounded fake, like they were following directions instead of actually finding something funny. I ducked down in my seat as they walked by, not wanting them to see me. When the last person went inside their house, I started my truck and drove back to the cabin, feeling more creeped out than I wanted to admit. The next few days, I checked out the woods around town, partly because I was interested and partly to avoid the weird feeling in town. The forest around Ash Hollow was pretty but strange. I'd stop on a trail, sure I heard footsteps behind me, only to find nobody there. The pine trees didn't act like trees should. On a day with no wind, I watched a huge pine's branches slowly bend toward me as I got closer, then straighten when I backed up. I tried it several times, going forward and backing up, until I was sure I wasn't imagining it. The trees were following my movements. At sunset, I hiked to a ridge looking down at the valley where Ash Hollow sat. As the sun went down behind the mountains, shadows stretched across town. Way too long, weird shapes that moved on their own. Buildings made shadows that reached much farther than they should, dark lines that seemed to search the streets. The creepiest thing was when I visited the river on the east side of town. I sat on the bank, enjoying a rare, peaceful afternoon, when the water in front of me started bubbling in patterns. The bubbles made shapes like letters or symbols, appearing and disappearing too fast to read, but definitely seeming like some kind of message. I leaned in closer, trying to figure out the patterns, when a voice behind me made me jump. "Wouldn't get too close if I were you." I turned to find an elderly man standing several feet away, leaning on a walking stick. Unlike other residents, his expression held something like genuine concern. "The current's stronger than it looks," he added, gesturing toward the water with his stick. "I was just watching the bubbles," I said. "They make interesting patterns." His face tightened. "Just reflections and tricks of the light. Nothing worth studying." He glanced over his shoulder, then back at me. "You're the new fellow in the old Mackenzie cabin." "Daniel Carter," I confirmed. "Folks noticed you watching the Wednesday gathering." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the breeze off the water. "I was just driving by." "No, you weren't." His watery eyes held mine. "You'll be invited soon enough. Best to accept when it happens." Without another word, he turned and walked away, his previously stooped posture straightening with each step, until he moved with the same fluid grace I'd observed after the church service. The sun was going down as I drove home, with tree shadows making weird patterns on the road. I swear some of those shadows moved the wrong way, like they were reaching for my truck. When I got home, my front door was still locked like I'd left it, but as soon as I walked in, I knew someone had been inside. Nothing was trashed, no open drawers or damage. But things were different. My armchair wasn't where I left it. The books on my shelf were in some weird order I couldn't figure out. My coffee mug was sitting in the middle of the kitchen table instead of by the sink. What really freaked me out was what they did with Lydia's picture. I always keep it on my nightstand. It shows her laughing in the sunshine from before she got sick. Now the frame was face down, right in the middle of my pillow. I looked through every room and closet but found nobody. The bathroom window was unlocked. I know I locked it, but no signs that someone broke in. Whoever came in either had a key or knew another way inside. When it got dark, I checked all the locks again and even put a chair under the doorknob. I kept a baseball bat next to me while I sat in the dark, listening to the forest sounds. Around midnight, I started hearing whispers. They came from everywhere at once, soft, hissing voices that almost sounded like words. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but they had this weird rhythm, like someone repeating the same prayer over and over. I went from window to window, trying to see outside. With no moon, the forest was completely black. No lights were on in town. Only the stars gave any light, and they seemed too far away to help. The whispers kept going until morning, never getting louder or quieter, just that same rhythm hour after hour. I caught myself swaying while I stood guard, my brain trying to make sense of the sound. Just before sunrise, everything went quiet. The sudden silence was almost scarier than the whispers. What came after was a stillness that felt heavy around my cabin. I stood at the window as the first bit of daylight came through the trees. The forest looked normal, but something had changed. Everything seemed to be waiting, like something was about to happen. The silence that came with sunrise didn't leave. I sat at my kitchen table, cup of coffee growing cold between my palms, listening for any sound in the forest surrounding my cabin. The birds weren't singing. No breeze rustled through the pine needles. Even the usual creaking of the cabin's old timber frame had stopped. I needed answers. After grabbing my jacket and keys, I headed to my truck, noticing my doorknob was damp even though it hadn't rained. The drive into town seemed to take forever today. Ash Hollow's town hall was in a short, two-story gray stone building at the end of Main Street. A small hand-painted sign pointed to the Historical Society archives around back. I parked and followed the narrow gravel path to an old wooden door with peeling green paint. Inside, dust floated in the beams of light coming through dirty windows. Metal shelves full of boxes, folders, and old books lined up to make narrow walkways through the room. The place smelled musty, like old paper, mildew, and something else I couldn't quite identify, something kind of chemical. "We're not open to the public," said a voice from behind a tall shelf. An old man came out, looking at me like he didn't trust me one bit. His face was thin and wrinkled, and he held a notebook in his stained hands with yellow fingernails. "I'm Daniel Carter," I said. "I recently moved into the old cabin on Pine Ridge Road, just trying to learn a bit about the town's history." "Mr. Blackwood," he replied, not offering his hand. "Most folks here aren't interested in the past." "Well, I am. I'm a history teacher, was anyway. It's a professional habit." His watery eyes narrowed slightly. A bunch of old keys jingled at his belt as he shuffled closer. "We don't have much to see, just local records, property deeds, that sort of thing." He made no move to help me or direct me to anything specific. "Mind if I just browse a bit?" I hesitated, then gave a slight nod. "Close up when you leave. Door locks automatically." He turned and shuffled back behind the shelves, but I knew he hadn't left. I could hear the soft creak of a chair as he settled in to watch me. I moved through the aisles slowly, looking at shelf labels. Most contained ordinary town records, tax assessments, property transfers, minutes from town meetings. But in the back corner, on the bottom shelf, a box labeled 1879 Incident caught my eye. Kneeling down, I pulled the box out and removed the lid. Inside lay several yellowed newspaper clippings, photographs, and an official-looking report bound with faded red ribbon. I carried these to a small reading table and began to examine them. The first newspaper article, dated October 12, 1879, carried the headline, "Entire Settlement Vanished, 52 Residents of Ash Hollow Missing." I read the article twice, trying to understand the details. According to reports, a mail carrier arrived at Ash Hollow on October 10th to find the settlement completely deserted. Homes stood empty but undisturbed. Tables were set with meals half-eaten. A pot of stew still hung over a cold fireplace. Personal belongings remained in place. Not a single resident could be located. The accompanying photographs showed search parties combing through the abandoned settlement. What struck me was how the forest had pushed into several outlying homes, trees and brush seemingly advancing overnight to partially swallow structures. In one image, a cabin similar to mine stood half consumed by forest, as if the trees had grown through it in impossible ways. I flipped through additional articles documenting the failed search effort. Theories ranged from Indian attacks to mass hysteria leading to an exodus. One article quoted a search party member who insisted they'd found footprints leading from every house directly into the woods, as if each resident had walked in a straight line away from their home at the same moment. The official report proved even more disturbing. It documented interviews with residents of nearby settlements who claimed Ash Hollow had always been odd. Residents rarely left town and discouraged visitors. They held strange religious services that outsiders weren't permitted to attend. Several merchants mentioned that in the months before the disappearance, Ash Hollow residents had begun to change physically, their skin taking on an unusual paleness, their movements becoming too graceful to be natural. Most interesting was a small note at the bottom of the final page. One survivor confirmed, E. Carter found 15 miles south, claims no memory of events. E. Carter. The name hit me like a physical blow. I dug deeper into the box and found a small leather journal. Opening it revealed a property deed in the name of Ezekiel Carter, dated 1877, for a plot of land that matched the location of my cabin. My hands shook slightly as I turned the brittle pages. This went beyond coincidence. My great-grandfather's name had been Ezekiel, though family stories only mentioned him coming west after serving in the Civil War. Nothing about a vanished town. "Find something interesting?" Mr. Blackwood's voice made me jump. He stood at the end of the table, staring at the document spread before me. "Did you know my cabin once belonged to an Ezekiel Carter?" I asked. His mouth tightened into a thin line. Lots of Carters in Oregon's history. Ezekiel Carter, who was apparently the only survivor of whatever happened here in 1879. My great-grandfather's name was Ezekiel Carter. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe fear. "That's quite a coincidence," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Is it? Because it seems like more than that. What happened to the original settlement? Progress happened, towns die out, people move on." He reached for the journal. "These materials aren't for public viewing." I placed my hand on the journal before he could take it. The article mentioned 52 people vanished overnight. They didn't move on. They disappeared. Their homes were abandoned mid-meal. Sensationalist reporting, common in those days. His fingers trembled slightly as he gestured to the documents. "I'll need to close up now. It's only 3 o'clock. I have other duties. Pastor Marsh requires preparations for this evening's service." I gathered the documents, pretending to organize them for return, but slipped a few of the smaller photographs into my jacket pocket when he turned to retrieve the box. "Wednesday service," I said. "I've noticed everyone attends." His watery eyes fixed on me with new intensity. "Every soul in Ash Hollow values their spiritual health. You'd be welcome to join us. Maybe I will." He snatched the box from the table the second I placed the last document inside. "I think you'll find our community has much to offer those who participate fully." I stood up, maintaining eye contact. "What happened to Ezekiel Carter after they found him? If he was your relation, shouldn't your family know?" He clutched the box against his chest. "Outsiders come with questions, Mr. Carter, but rarely stay long enough for answers. I'm not planning on leaving anytime soon. We'll see." He shuffled toward the shelves. "Lock the door on your way out." Outside, the afternoon sun did little to warm the chill that had settled in my stomach. I walked slowly down Main Street, aware of eyes tracking my movement from behind storefront windows. Each time I turned to look, curtains fluttered closed or shopkeepers stepped back into shadows. I reached the stone bridge at the center of town and paused, looking down at the dark water flowing beneath. Something about the river bothered me. I leaned against the railing, studying the unnaturally black current. The water perfectly reflected the trees and buildings along the bank with mirror-like precision, except where my reflection should have been. That space remained an empty void in the otherwise perfect reflection. I waved my hand over the water. Nothing. I moved left, then right. Still nothing, while the surrounding landscape continued to mirror flawlessly. It was as if I didn't exist to the water below. A church bell rang in the distance, making me straighten up. I checked my watch. Exactly 5 o'clock. The bell rang 5 times, then silence returned. I decided to stay in town until the evening service, determined to see what happened inside that church. I ate dinner at the small diner on Main Street, ignoring the stares from other patrons, then parked my truck on a small access road behind the church. As darkness fell, I watched the procession begin. Just like Sunday night, residents emerging from their homes simultaneously, walking in perfect unison toward the church. This time, I was prepared. Once everyone entered, I crept through the churchyard to a side window with a broken latch I'd spotted earlier. The colored glass was intact, but a small panel at the bottom pivoted open, allowing me to peer inside. The interior looked nothing like a typical church. No pews, no altar, no religious symbols I recognized. The congregation stood in a perfect circle around what appeared to be a hole in the floor. From my angle, I could see that the hole contained a black liquid that didn't reflect the candles burning around the room. Pastor Marsh stood at the circle's edge, his tall, thin frame swaying slightly as he raised his hands. I noticed with a jolt of revulsion that his fingers appeared partially webbed. When he spoke, his voice carried an unusual resonance. We drink and are renewed. We serve and are preserved. We wait and are rewarded. One by one, the townspeople walked up to the black pool. Each got down on their knees, scooped up some water with their hands, and drank. As they stood back up, something changed about them. Their skin looked healthier, they stood straighter, and they moved better. This only lasted a few seconds, but you could definitely tell the difference. Whatever was in that water was making them feel younger. When everyone else had finished, Pastor Marsh took his turn and drank. The change hit him harder. For just a moment, his skin went almost see-through, with dark blue veins showing underneath. He stood up with his eyes closed, looking like he was feeling the best he'd ever felt. "The time approaches," he announced, his voice now stronger. "The promise fulfilled. The bloodline returned. After generations, our patience rewards us." A chill ran through me. I backed away from the window, not wanting to hear more. Whatever was happening involved me. The returned bloodline had to refer to my connection to Ezekiel Carter. I hurried back to my truck and drove toward home, taking the winding forest road faster than was safe. About halfway there, I realized the road didn't look right. Trees crowded closer to the edges than I remembered, and turns appeared where straight stretches should be. I slowed, trying to orient myself. The headlights illuminated an unfamiliar fork in the road. I was certain this divide hadn't existed this morning. I took the right fork, which seemed to head in the general direction of my cabin, but after a mile, it curved sharply back toward town. I turned around and tried the left fork, but it led to a dead end where trees had grown across the road, forming an impenetrable wall of trunks and branches. The trees looked as if they'd been there for decades, not hours. Every route I tried led me deeper into the forest or back toward town. The road seemed to rearrange itself with each attempt to navigate home. My headlights caught movement among the trees, branches bending toward my truck, reaching out like fingers. I was ready to abandon the vehicle and try on foot when the first raindrops hit my windshield. Within seconds, a downpour engulfed the truck. Through the curtain of water, I watched as the trees shrank back from the road, their branches withdrawing like they were avoiding the rain. The road straightened before my eyes, landmarks I knew showing up again. I accelerated, following the now clear path to my cabin. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the rain had stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I sat in the truck, engine idling, staring at my dark cabin. The photographs in my pocket felt heavy with implication. My great-grandfather had escaped whatever happened in 1879, and now, generations later, I had unwittingly returned to the same town, the same cabin. Whatever had taken the original residents wanted something from the Carter bloodline, and somehow, they'd manipulated events to bring me here. I killed the engine and sat in darkness, listening to the drip of water from the trees and the soft tick of the cooling engine. The silence of the forest pressed in around me once again, but now I understood its nature. It wasn't the silence of peace or solitude. It was the silence of anticipation. I spent Saturday night awake, pushing my dresser against the front door and wedging chairs under every doorknob in the cabin. The photographs from the archive lay spread across my kitchen table under the harsh light of the single bulb, evidence of a town frozen in time. In one yellowed image, a search party stood on the same stone bridge I'd crossed yesterday, their expressions puzzled as they examined the abandoned settlement. The face of the man on the far left triggered something in my memory. An identical face had nodded at me from behind the counter at the hardware store just days ago. The night hours stretched endlessly. I checked and rechecked my barricades, watching shadows play across the floor as clouds passed over the moon. No whispers came from the forest. No branches tapped against my windows. The silence was absolute, as if the entire town was holding its breath. Sunday morning arrived without birdsong or wind. The stillness had a physical quality, pressing against the cabin like a living thing. I paced from window to window, peering through the blinds at the motionless trees, the empty dirt road leading to town. My phone showed no signal, not unusual in these mountains, but the total absence of even a single bar felt deliberate now. I tried the landline, hearing nothing but dead air. Even the clock on the wall had stopped at 11:58, though the battery was new. I sat at the kitchen table, my father's old revolver beside the photographs. The weapon provided little comfort against whatever waited in Ash Hollow, but its weight anchored me to reality. At precisely noon, the floorboards darkened near the walls. I stood up, knocking my chair backward as moisture seeped through invisible cracks, pooling at the edges of the room. The water moved with purpose, ignoring gravity's pull, crawling upward along baseboards and door frames. I backed away, revolver in hand, as the puddles grew and deepened. The water converged in 3 distinct locations, rising up like clay on a potter's wheel. Humanoid forms took shape, arms, legs, torsos, heads, but without features, just smooth reflective surfaces where faces should be. "Stay back," I warned, aiming the gun at the nearest figure. My voice sounded flat in the airless room. The water creatures didn't talk. They moved together like they were connected, flowing across the floor instead of walking. I shot at the closest one. The bullet just went through it, leaving a hole that closed up right away. I freaked out. I tried to run, but their hands grabbed my ankles. They felt solid even though they looked like water. I fell hard and my gun slid across the floor. In seconds, they were all over me, cold and wet as they pulled me toward the door. The dresser I'd pushed against the door didn't stop them. They squeezed through the cracks and reformed, then pushed my furniture aside like it was nothing. When the door opened, I saw the bright sun in a clear sky, and below it, everyone from Ash Hollow. They stood on both sides of the dirt road from my cabin. Everyone, men, women, kids, all lined up the same way, looking at me with empty faces. Nobody moved to help as the water things dragged me outside. Nobody answered when I yelled for help. They made a human corridor all the way to town, a path that led straight to the church in the distance. The creatures pulled me along while I dug my heels into the dirt, trying to stop. Each person turned their head at the exact same time to watch us pass, then looked forward again once we went by. By the time we got to town, I was too tired to fight much. The creatures never let go or loosened their grip. They pulled me through the quiet streets, past closed shops and empty parks, until we reached the iron fence around the church. The gate opened as we got close. The water things dragged me up the stone steps and through the heavy wooden doors, which shut behind us with a loud bang. Inside, the church looked completely different. The pews were gone. The wooden floor had been ripped out, showing a huge round pit that took up most of the room. A narrow stone path ran around the edge with nothing to keep you from falling in. In the pit was black water, not normal water that reflects light, but something that just sucked light in. The liquid moved in weird ways, sometimes almost making shapes you could recognize before breaking apart again. The water creatures let go of me and backed away to the walls where they melted into puddles and seeped between the floorboards. I stood alone on the path with the impossible pit in front of me. I noticed movement across the way. Pastor Marsh came through a door I hadn't seen before, walking the narrow stone path with creepy steadiness. In the church's natural light, I could finally see what he really looked like. His skin was see-through like those blind fish in caves, with dark blue veins showing underneath. His fingers weren't covered by gloves anymore, and I could see webbing between them. When he looked at me, his eyes had no pupils, just pale white balls that didn't reflect anything. "Daniel Carter," he said, his voice carrying that strange underwater resonance I'd heard before. "You've returned to us at last." The doors behind me opened again. The townspeople came in, all moving together in a creepy way, making a circle around the pit and blocking every way out. "I've never been here before," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Not you specifically, no." Pastor Marsh smiled, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous, too pointed. "But your blood has. Your essence. The promise made must be kept." What promise? The one your ancestor made when we allowed him to leave. His webbed hand gestured to the pit. When we spared Ezekiel Carter, alone among all inhabitants of Ash Hollow. I thought of the documents I'd seen, the single line noting one survivor. My great-grandfather escaped whatever happened in 1879. Escaped? Pastor Marsh laughed, a sound like water rushing through a narrow pipe. No one escapes the deep one. Ezekiel Carter was permitted to leave, on condition that he would return with his bloodline when called. The congregation swayed slightly, the movement spreading through the crowd. What happened to the original settlers? I asked, playing for time, eyes darting around for any possible escape route. They were worthy, said Pastor Marsh. They gave themselves willingly to the deep one, becoming part of something eternal. Their physical forms may have gone, but they remain in the water, in the trees, in the very soil of Ash Hollow. He spread his arms. As we all do, between renewals. Understanding dawned with sickening clarity. The services. You're drinking from that thing to stay alive. To remain as we are, he corrected. The deep one preserves us but requires periodic renewal, a small sacrifice for immortality. You've been here since 1879, I said. All of you. Waiting. Pastor Marsh took another step toward me. The deep one has rejected all substitute offerings we've attempted. It wants only what was promised, the Carter bloodline. We've tried others, those who stumbled upon our town by accident or who came searching for missing loved ones. None satisfied the deep one's hunger. He pointed at the black pool. It's been waiting, pulling strings for generations to get you here. Your wife getting sick, you being sad, that perfect house listing you found. It set it all up to keep its old promise. I got really angry. You're telling me this thing made Lydia die? The deep one removes obstacles, Pastor Marsh said simply. It called you here, to this specific place at this specific time. The confluence of bloodlines and celestial alignments occurs rarely. We could not miss this opportunity. I remembered the photographs in my pocket, my only possible leverage. And what happens if I refuse? You are already here, Pastor Marsh said. The choice was made the moment you crossed into Ash Hollow. The people started moving, making their circles smaller as they came at me like robots. I backed up until my heels hit the edge of the pit. The black water below looked like it was rising a little. Wait, I said, pulling the photographs from my pocket. I want to show you something first. I held up the first image, a town gathering from 1879, the faces clear enough to recognize. This is you, I said, pointing to a figure at the edge of the frame. And you, I continued, indicating a woman near the front of the crowd. Every single one of you is in this photograph. I held up the second image, the search party on the bridge. And here, the same faces, unchanged. The effect was immediate but subtle. A flicker of confusion passed across the blank expressions of the townspeople. Several blinked rapidly, as if struggling to focus. This is impossible, I pressed. You haven't aged in over a century. Whatever this thing is, it's not preserving you. It's trapping you. Deception, Pastor Marsh hissed, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. The images are falsified. They're from your own archives, I countered. Documents your Mr. Blackwood tried to keep from me. The congregation's perfect timing broke down. Some looked at their neighbors with the first signs of individual thought I'd seen. Confusion, doubt, fear. Pastor Marsh's composure cracked. Enough! The offering will proceed. He gestured sharply, and the townspeople surged forward. But their movements were no longer perfectly coordinated. They bumped into one another, hesitated, some even stepping back rather than advancing. I seized the moment of confusion, ducking under reaching arms and darting along the stone walkway. I made it halfway around the pit before the first townsperson grabbed at me. I shoved them aside, their balance unusually poor, as if they were relearning how to move their bodies independently. The doors lay just ahead, my path to freedom clear for a crucial moment. I ran, feet slapping against stone, lungs burning with each breath. I reached the doorway, hands connecting with the weathered wood, ready to push to safety. Then the voice came from the pit. Daniel. I froze. It was my mother's voice. the exact sound and warmth I hadn't heard since her funeral 12 years ago. "Daniel, sweetheart, don't leave." I turned slowly, against every instinct screaming at me to run. The black water had risen higher, nearly reaching the walkway's edge. Its surface bulged in the center, taking the shape of something vaguely human. "Mom?" My voice cracked on the word. The water rippled, the shape changing, becoming more defined. Then it spoke again, but with a different voice, one that froze me in place. "Danny, it's me." It was Lydia's voice. I knew it right away, the way her voice would break a bit on some words and that laugh of hers that came after. "I've been waiting for you," her voice continued. "We can be together again. Everyone you've lost is here." I stood shaking in the doorway, with one hand on the door and the other reaching out toward the pit without me even meaning to. The townspeople stopped coming closer and just stared at me harder than before. "It's not real," I whispered to myself, but doubt gnawed at my certainty. "It feels real," Lydia's voice answered as if reading my thoughts. "I feel real, Danny. Come find out for yourself." Pastor Marsh had moved behind me, his eyes looking like he'd won something. "The deep one offers what nothing else can, reunion with all you've lost. Step into the water, and you'll never be alone again." I looked back at the door, my way out just inches away. On the other side was freedom, but also being alone. The empty cabin, days without Lydia, and photos that would eventually fade just like my memories of her laugh. In front of me, the dark water seemed to promise things I knew couldn't be real, but the voice had sounded exactly like her. The congregation watched me waiting. Their futures depended on what I decided, just like mine did. The photos had shown me the truth. They were stuck here, kept in some weird state for over 100 years. If I left, what would happen to them? If I stayed, would I just end up as another face in those old pictures? Another person stuck in this place? I stood in the doorway, torn between running away and giving up, between living alone and believing I could see her again, knowing my choice would affect my fate and the town's.